The social worker set the folder on the table between us and said she was sorry, and she said it the way people say things they mean but have said many times before. I looked at the documents inside that folder, and I did not say anything for a long time. Outside the window of that county office in Millbrook, Georgia, it was raining, the particular gray rain of a November afternoon that makes everything look like a memory of itself. The folder contained 31 years of records. And what those records said was that I had been worth quite a lot of money to two people who had made sure I never had enough to eat. But to understand what was in that folder, you need to know who I was before I saw it. My name is Cecilia Pruitt. I am 37 years old, and I have been a fifth-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary School in Millbrook, Georgia, for 11 years. I teach language arts and social studies, and I am the kind of teacher who keeps granola bars in her desk drawer because she has noticed that some children are hungrier at 2 in the afternoon than the school day accounts for. I have been keeping granola bars in that drawer since my 3rd year. I do not make a point of it. I just make sure they are there. I grew up in the same town where I teach. I went to Millbrook Elementary myself, which means I have occasionally had the experience of sitting at the same desk where a teacher once sat across from me. And the symmetry of that is something I have thought about more than I can easily explain. My classroom smells like dry erase markers and the particular dusty warmth of old books, and I keep a jar of dried lavender on the windowsill because a student gave it to me 4 years ago and I have never moved it. That smell, lavender and old paper, is the smell of the place I built for myself after I understood that the place I came from had never been built for me at all. I was raised by Margaret and Dennis Pruitt in a house on Callaway Street, 3 blocks from the school where I now teach. Margaret is 63. Dennis passed away 8 years ago from a heart condition that the doctors had been warning him about for a decade. My sister Renee is 4 years older than me and lives 20 minutes away in Warner Robins with her husband and 2 daughters. We have not spoken in 2 years and 8 months, and the reason we have not spoken is the reason I am telling you this story. Growing up, I understood that things in our house were distributed unevenly. Renee had a bedroom with a window seat and a canopy bed that our parents had bought from an actual furniture store. I had a bedroom with a mattress on the floor and a single overhead bulb. Renee had after-school activities, dance class until she was 12 and then volleyball through high school. I had chores that started when I got home and ended when dinner was finished. Renee's plate at dinner was always full. Mine was whatever was left, which was sometimes enough and sometimes not, and on the nights when it was not enough, I learned to drink extra glasses of water before bed because it helped with the particular hollow feeling that I did not have a name for until I was an adult and read the clinical word for it. I want to be careful here about something. I am not asking you to feel sorry for me. I am asking you to understand the architecture of what I lived in, because the architecture matters for what comes later. I had reasons to trust the version of things my parents gave me. The reason they gave me was that I was difficult. Not in a specific documentable way, but in the ambient, unfalsifiable way that children can be accused of when the adults in the room have agreed on a story. I was told I was ungrateful. I was told I did not appreciate what I had. I was told that Renee simply required more because Renee was more sensitive, more delicate, more in need of protection. I was told this so consistently and from such an early age that I spent a significant portion of my adult life in a therapist's office working through the specific damage that ambient accusation does to a person's ability to assess her own reality. What I want you to notice, looking back, is that I believed them. Not completely, not in the place in myself that knew the granola bars mattered. But enough. Enough to stay. Enough to keep coming to Sunday dinners well into my 30s. Enough to sit across from my mother and my sister and eat whatever was on my plate and tell myself this was what family looked like. There were warning signs I dismissed as coincidences. The first was a conversation I overheard when I was about 14, my mother on the phone in the kitchen saying something about a monthly amount and then going quiet when she heard me come down the stairs. I asked what she was talking about, and she said it was a bill. I noted it and moved on. Because that is what children do when the alternative is something they cannot afford to consider. The second was a comment my father made once, only once, when I was in college. He said, in a moment of what I think now was accidental honesty, that things would have been simpler if I had gone back earlier. I asked what he meant. He said never mind and changed the subject, and I let him, because I was 20 years old, and I did not have the specific vocabulary yet for the shape of the thing he had almost said. The third was Renee, at a family dinner 6 years ago, telling her daughter not to ask Aunt Cecilia about when she was little. Her daughter was 9 years old, and she had just asked me a perfectly ordinary question about whether I had been good at drawing when I was her age. I said yes, and I changed the subject, and I filed the look on Renee's face in the part of my mind where I kept things I did not yet know what to do with. I found out later that while I was sitting at that table and keeping my voice pleasant and passing the rolls, Renee had known the full truth for at least 3 years. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Sunday in March 3 years ago. I had driven over to Renee's house in Warner Robins for what had become our monthly obligation, the kind of family gathering that exists more out of momentum than warmth. My mother was there, Renee's husband Greg was there, and Renee's two daughters were there, Lily, who was 12, and Maya, who was 9. I was helping Maya with a puzzle at the coffee table while the adults talked in the kitchen. Maya was the kind of child who said whatever was in her mind without editing it first, which is a quality I have always found more refreshing than inconvenient, probably because of what I do for a living. She looked up from the puzzle and said, completely without preamble, that her mom had told Grandma last week that the check money was almost used up, and they needed to figure out what to do about Aunt Cecilia. I looked at Maya. I kept my face completely still, the way I have learned to keep my face still when a student says something in class that tells me a great deal more than they intended to tell me. I said, in my most ordinary voice, what check money she meant. Maya said the money that came every month. She said it the way children say things that are simply facts of their household landscape. Unremarkable, part of the furniture. She said Grandma had been getting it for a long time, and Mom said it was complicated. I said that sounded interesting. I handed her a puzzle piece. She went back to the puzzle. My hands did not shake. I registered that as a fact about myself, the way I register other facts about myself in difficult moments, methodically and without editorial comment. I sat at that coffee table for another 40 minutes. I helped finish the puzzle. I ate dinner. I helped clear the plates. I said my goodbyes at the door, and I drove home on the interstate, and I did not turn the radio on. I sat in my parked car in my own driveway for approximately 10 minutes. And I thought about the word complicated. I thought about what kind of money comes monthly, attached to a child for a long time. That the people receiving it would describe to their own daughter as complicated. I thought about what kind of money runs out. And then I went inside and I opened my laptop and I started looking. Now I want to be clear about where I was in that moment. I was not angry yet. Anger came later, and when it came, it was the right size for what I found, which is to say, it was very large. But in that first hour, I was not angry. I was a fifth-grade teacher at 11:30 at night, which is to say, I was someone who has spent 11 years locating the thing underneath the thing that children present to you, and I was applying that skill to the only subject I had been failing to examine clearly for 37 years, my own life. Because what I was about to find, in the public records and the state databases and eventually in that county office with the social worker and the rain outside the window, would not just explain my childhood. It would explain why I had been worth something to them at all. And it would reveal a number, a specific monthly dollar amount that would tell me exactly what my hunger had been worth to two people who had decided it was an acceptable cost of doing business. They had no idea what Maya had just done, and I was going to let them keep not knowing, for a while. The first thing I did was request my own birth certificate. Not because I did not have one, but because I wanted the original, the one filed at the county level, the one that existed before any subsequent documents were layered on top of it. I requested it through the Georgia Department of Public Health Vital Records office on a Monday morning, standing in my classroom before my students arrived, using the school's printer to fill out the form, because my home printer was out of ink and I did not want to wait. The birth certificate arrived 11 days later. It listed my mother as Margaret Ann Pruitt. The father line listed Dennis Ray Pruitt, both names I had grown up with. Nothing on the face of that document was surprising. What was surprising was the notation in the lower left corner that I had looked at my entire life without understanding what it meant. A case number, a county designation, a processing code that I had always assumed was standard administrative formatting. It was not standard administrative formatting. I took a photograph of that notation, and I sent it to a woman named Patricia Odom, who was not a lawyer, but who had spent 22 years as a paralegal in the Bibb County family court system before retiring to Millbrook, and who attended the same church I did, and who had once helped me understand the paperwork when I bought my house. I sent her the photograph with a message explaining only that I had found a notation I did not understand and asking if she could tell me what it meant. She called me back within the hour. Her voice had the quality it gets when she is being careful, measured, and slower than usual. She said the notation indicated that my birth record had been amended at some point after the original filing. She said amended birth records in the Georgia system from that era were most commonly associated with one of two things: a late paternity establishment or an adoption or foster placement that had been legally formalized after the fact. I said I had never been told I was adopted or fostered. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said I might want to request my full case file from the Division of Family and Children Services, and that I was entitled to do so as an adult who had aged out of or been discharged from any relevant proceedings. She said it gently, the way she says difficult things, with the particular gentleness of someone who has spent 22 years watching people receive information they were not prepared for. I filed the request that afternoon. Certified mail, return receipt requested. I wrote the cover letter in my classroom during my planning period, at the same desk where I had written probably 400 parent communications and twice as many lesson plans, and I kept my handwriting steady. The file took 3 weeks to arrive. When it did, it came in a large brown envelope with a state seal on the return address, and I set it on my kitchen table, and I made a full pot of coffee before I opened it. The file was 63 pages. I had been placed in foster care at 14 months old, following a neglect determination involving my biological mother, whose name I will not use here because she is not the subject of this story, and because I do not yet know what I want to say about her. The placement had been with Margaret and Dennis Pruitt, who were licensed foster parents in Baldwin County at the time. The placement was intended to be temporary. It became permanent not through adoption, but through a legal guardianship arrangement finalized when I was 4 years old, which preserved the foster care payment structure rather than converting to an adoption subsidy, which would have paid less. I want you to understand what that means. An adoption would have paid them less. So they did not adopt me. The monthly payment from the state of Georgia for my foster care and guardianship had continued until I turned 18. The amount varied across the years as the state adjusted its rates, but the average across the full period was $412 per month. Over 14 years, that was approximately $69,000 paid to Margaret and Dennis Pruitt, specifically for my care, my food, my clothing, my medical needs, my education. I sat at my kitchen table with that number in front of me, and I drank my coffee, and I did not move for a long time. There was more. My biological father, whose identity I had not known, had died when I was 7 years old. He had listed me as a beneficiary on a modest life insurance policy, having been notified of my existence by the state during the neglect proceedings. That policy had paid out a lump sum of $14,000, which had been placed in a restricted account designated for my benefit and managed by my legal guardians, Margaret and Dennis Pruitt. The account had been drawn down to zero by the time I turned 12. The withdrawal records showed a series of transfers to the Pruitt's personal checking account, each under the reporting threshold, over approximately 18 months. Patricia Odom looked at those withdrawal records when I brought her the file. She read them twice without speaking. Then she said very quietly that what she was looking at had a specific legal name, and that name was misappropriation of a minor's designated funds, and that it did not have a statute of limitations in Georgia when the misappropriating party was the legal guardian. I wrote that down. I am a teacher. I write things down. She also said something else that I have thought about many times since. She said that the monthly foster payments were public funds, taxpayer money, disbursed for a specific and documented purpose, and that if those funds had not been used for that purpose, there were state agencies whose entire function was to care about that fact. She said the word FOIA, the way she says words that are tools, plainly, without drama, as information. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with 3 separate agencies over the following 2 weeks: the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services, the Baldwin County Department of Human Services, and the Social Security Administration, because Patricia had noted, while reviewing my file, a reference to a survivor benefit application filed on my behalf following my biological father's death, an application that should have resulted in monthly payments to my account until I turned 18, payments I had never seen or known about. That last request took 6 weeks to process. When the response arrived, it confirmed that Social Security survivor benefits had been paid monthly into an account designated for my care from the time I was 7 until I turned 18. The total across 11 years was just over $31,000. The account had been managed by my legal guardians. The account had been closed and the balance transferred when I was 14, 2 years before the payments ended, which meant the final 2 years of payments had gone somewhere else entirely. Patricia looked at the Social Security response for a long time. Then she looked at me and said that I needed an attorney, not a paralegal, and that she knew someone in Macon who handled exactly this category of case and who had a reputation for being thorough in a way that made opposing counsel uncomfortable. His name was Robert Fells. He had been practicing elder and dependent adult financial abuse law for 19 years. I drove to Macon on a Saturday morning and sat in his office and put the full file on his desk and watched him read it. He read slowly. He asked 2 questions during the reading, and neither of them were about me. They were about the withdrawal records and the account closure date. When he finished, he said the civil exposure here was significant. He said it without excitement, the way competent people state facts. He said the state agencies would likely pursue their own parallel investigations once the FOIA results were formally submitted as complaints, and that those investigations would generate their own documentation, and that documentation would be useful. He said I should not contact my mother or my sister. He said to let the paper do what paper does. I told him I understood completely. He said one more thing before I left. He said he had handled a number of these cases over the years, cases where guardians had treated the financial apparatus of a child's care as a personal revenue stream, and that in his experience the thing that most surprised his clients was not the money. It was the paperwork, the amount of documentation that existed sitting in county files and state databases and federal records, simply waiting for someone to request it. He said the system had known things about my childhood that I had not known. It had simply never been asked. And then I pulled the Social Security disbursement records one more time, and I saw the account number on the final 2 years of transfers, and I had to sit down. The account the final payments had been transferred to was not a guardianship account. It was a personal account. It was opened in 2001 when I was 15 years old. The account holder was Renee Louise Pruitt. My sister had her own account, funded with my survivor benefits, starting the year she turned 19 and left for college. She had done this knowingly. This was not something she had discovered as an adult and stayed silent about. She had been the recipient. The attorney went very quiet when I sent him the account records. I watched his response email arrive at 11:17 at night. 3 words: I see it. I had one meeting left. It was not going to be with my family. It was going to be with a social worker in a county office on a rainy November afternoon, and she was going to set a folder on the table and say she was sorry, and I was going to look at 31 years of records and finally understand that the hunger I had been told was my own fault had been, all along, a budget line. I want to pause here for just a moment. Because at this point, I had the foster care file, the Social Security records, the withdrawal documentation, the account transfer that had Renee's name on it, and Robert Fells, who had 19 years of experience making opposing counsel uncomfortable. I had filed formal complaints with 2 state agencies and the Social Security Administration's Office of Inspector General. The investigations were open. The paper was moving. And my mother had called me twice in the past month with messages that said only to call her back when I had a chance. And I had not called her back, and she did not know why, and I was going to let her keep not knowing. Because I had been underestimated in that house since I was 14 months old, and I was not going to correct that assumption one single day before I had to. The county office of the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services in Milledgeville smelled like carpet cleaner and the particular stillness of a government building on a rainy afternoon. There were plastic chairs in the waiting area and a reception window with a sliding panel and a bulletin board with laminated pages that had been there long enough to curl at the corners. I had driven 40 minutes to get there on a Tuesday morning, using a personal day I had been saving since September. I wore the gray blazer I wear for parent-teacher conferences, the one that says I am a professional and I have prepared for this meeting. I brought the full file in a dark blue folder, organized by date, with tabs I had labeled over the previous weekend at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me. The social worker's name was Deborah Chance. She was 54 years old, she told me, and had been with the division for 26 years, and she had the manner of someone who had developed, over 2.5 decades, a precise and unsentimental compassion for the people who sat across from her. She had reviewed my complaint file before I arrived. When I walked in, she was already seated, and she had a folder of her own on the table, and she looked at me the way people look at someone they have been reading about and are now meeting for the first time. I sat down. I placed my folder on the table. I did not open it yet. She told me she had reviewed my complaint and the supporting documentation I had submitted, and that the division had conducted a preliminary review of the records associated with my placement and guardianship case. She said she wanted to walk me through what they had found, and that she wanted me to know I could stop her at any point if I needed a moment. I told her I was ready. She opened her folder. She confirmed the foster care payment history, the full 14 years of monthly disbursements to Margaret and Dennis Pruitt for my care. She confirmed the life insurance payout and the drawdown of the designated account. Then she set a specific document on the table between us and asked me to look at it. It was a quarterly expenditure report, the kind that licensed foster parents were required to submit to document how state funds were being used for a placed child. Margaret Pruitt had submitted these reports every quarter for 14 years. They listed clothing purchases, school supplies, medical copays, extracurricular activity fees, food costs. Deborah Chance pointed to the food cost line. She said the division had cross-referenced a sample of the submitted figures against the household size reported on the Pruitt's tax returns for the same years. She said the food expenditure figures submitted for my care were consistent across every quarterly report, with a pattern that suggested the reported amounts had not been spent on a second child in the household. She said it carefully and specifically, the way trained professionals say things that have legal weight. Then she placed a second document on the table. It was a summary of the Social Security survivor benefit payments, the disbursement account, and the transfer to the account in Renee Pruitt's name. She said the Office of the Inspector General had opened a formal investigation. She said the findings to date indicated that the transfer had been structured deliberately, meaning it had not been an administrative error. I looked at those two documents on the table between us, and I kept my hands flat on my folder, and I did not look away. Deborah Chance said she was sorry. She said it the way people say things they mean, but have said many times before, and I believed that she meant it, and I also understood that her meaning it did not change any of the documents on the table. I said I had one question. I asked whether the DNA test I had taken through a consumer genetics service, the one that had returned 0 matches within the Pruitt family line, and had instead returned a first-degree relative match to a woman in Augusta whose surname I had never heard, was consistent with what the division's records showed about my biological origins. Deborah Chance looked at me for a moment. Then she said yes. She said the records were consistent with that result. She said my biological family had not been the Pruitts. They had never been the Pruitts, and the records had known this for 37 years. The room was very quiet after that. Outside, through the window that looked onto the parking lot, I could hear the rain on the pavement. Someone's phone buzzed on the desk behind the reception window, and nobody moved to answer it. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a while afterward. I did not cry. I want to be precise about that, not because crying would have been wrong, but because what I actually did was more specific and more true. I sat there and I breathed, and I looked at the rain on the windshield, and I thought about a 9-year-old girl doing a puzzle on a Sunday afternoon, saying the most important sentence anyone had ever said to me in my life, completely without knowing it. Then I drove back to Millbrook. I had papers to grade. The formal outcomes took 14 months to complete. The Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services issued findings of guardianship fund misappropriation against the estate of Dennis Pruitt and against Margaret Pruitt individually. The civil judgment against Margaret Pruitt totaled $94,000, representing the calculated misuse of foster care payments, the life insurance fund drawdown, and associated penalties. The Social Security Office of the Inspector General referred the survivor benefit matter to the United States Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Georgia. Renee Pruitt entered into a cooperation agreement and repaid $31,000 in full, plus interest, in exchange for a deferred prosecution. Margaret Pruitt's cooperation was considerably less forthcoming, and the civil judgment stands as a lien against her property. Robert Fells called me when the last document was filed. He said it was done. He said it simply, without fanfare, the way competent people close a file. I thanked him. He said I had been a very organized client, and that organized clients made his work more effective. And I thought that was possibly the most useful compliment I had ever received. Renee called me 6 weeks after her cooperation agreement was finalized. I picked up because I had decided beforehand that I would. She said she was sorry. She said it twice. She said she had known since she was 19, when our mother had told her about the account transfer and explained it as a family decision, and that she had told herself for 20 years that the money was already gone anyway, and that saying something would only hurt everyone. She said she understood if I could not forgive her. I said I appreciated her calling. I said I needed more time. She said she understood. We said goodbye, and I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, and I stood there for a moment, and then I went and watered the plant on my windowsill because it was Thursday, and Thursday is when I water it. That was the most honest conversation Renee and I have ever had. We have not spoken since, and I do not know yet what shape the future of that holds. I have stopped trying to predict it. Patricia Odom came by my classroom the week after everything was finalized. She brought a small plant in a terracotta pot, a rosemary cutting from her garden, and she set it on my desk and said she thought it would do well in a sunny window. I thanked her and told her I owed her a great deal more than a thank you. She said she had just pointed me toward the door and that I had done the walking, which was both accurate and generous. Then she said she needed to get back to her garden before the frost came, and she left, and I set the rosemary next to the lavender on the windowsill. The two of them are still there. The rosemary has grown considerably. There is one more thing I have not told you yet. The first-degree relative match from the DNA test was a woman named Gloria Reese, 61 years old, living in Augusta. She was my biological mother's younger sister. My biological mother had died 11 years ago. But Gloria was alive, and she had been searchable, and she had agreed to meet me. We met at a diner in Augusta on a Saturday morning in April, 14 months after the county office, and the rain and the folder on the table. She was already there when I arrived. She had dark eyes and she held her coffee cup with both hands, and she looked at me for a long moment before she said anything. Then she said I looked like my mother around the eyes, and that my mother had been 22 years old and very frightened, and had believed, when she signed the papers, that she was doing the right thing by me. I do not know yet what to do with that information. I am still working on it. Gloria and I have had 4 conversations since that morning, which is 4 more than I expected to have, and I am approaching each one the way I approach difficult things, one at a time, without deciding in advance what the shape of it will be. My life 3 years after is specific and ordinary in the ways that matter. I wake up at 5:40 on school days. I make coffee in the same pot I have had for 6 years. I drive the same route to Millbrook Elementary that I have driven for 11 years, past the same gas station and the same Baptist church and the same stretch of pine trees that go golden in October. My classroom smells like dry erase markers and old books, and now rosemary and lavender, which is a combination that my students occasionally comment on and which I tell them simply that I like. Margaret Pruitt lives in the same house on Callaway Street, 3 blocks from where I teach. The civil lien is on that property. I do not drive past it if I can avoid it, not out of fear, but out of the same practical economy that makes me take the most efficient route to anywhere I am going. I have not spoken to her since before I filed the first complaint. I do not expect to. What I kept from all of it, the one thing I did not expect to keep, is a habit. I write things down now. Not just professionally, not just lesson plans and parent notes and the careful documentation that teaching requires. I write down what I observe and what I notice and what children say that contains more than they intended. I write it in a notebook I keep in my desk drawer, next to the granola bars. I started it the week after Maya and the puzzle and the word complicated, and I have filled 2 notebooks since. What I actually learned from all of this is not what I expected to learn. I expected to learn something about injustice or about the failures of systems designed to protect children. And I did learn those things, and they are true, and they matter. But the thing I learned that I did not expect is something smaller and more personal. That the hunger I had carried since childhood, the physical one and the other kind, had never been evidence of my own inadequacy. It had been evidence of someone else's. I had spent 37 years believing a story about myself that had been invented to justify a budget decision. That is the thing that took the longest to set down. The granola bars are still in the drawer. I restocked them last Monday. There are 12 in there right now, the kind with chocolate chips, because in my experience, those go faster. If any part of this is familiar to you, I would want to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to know what happened when I met Gloria Reese for the second time and what she brought with her to that meeting, there is more to this story.